Hello everyone and welcome in today's PCB webinar. My name is Gzim and I am the account manager for security portfolio at PCB, also the organizer of this webinar. I believe you all know that PCB organizes daily webinar in our 5 portfolios, and every week we organize a webinar on security portfolio covering different topics and areas. In this 30-minute webinar we will hear about topic how to turn an incident into an opportunity for your business through effective incident management. This webinar will be presented by Bryan Strawser, who is a principal consultant and CEO at Bryghtpath LLC and has more than 21 years of experience. I hope you will enjoy this webinar and find it very informative. If you have any question, you can write them in question box in right-hand control panel, or you can use the option to raise your hand and we will answer to all of them accordingly. Please, Bryan, you may continue.
All right. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I look forward to talking with you over the next 30 to 40 minutes. What you need to know about me in terms of background as we talk about incident management is that I spent 21 years at Target Corporation here in the United States, where I was responsible and built the global crisis management, business continuity, and intelligence teams. For the last 2 years, I've been co-founder and CEO of a consulting firm called Bryghtpath, based here in Minneapolis in the United States, and we really work on global risk, business continuity, emergency management, crisis communications, and public affairs issues. But what we're going to talk about today is how to take an incident or a crisis situation and really turn that through effective incident management and effective leadership into an opportunity for your company or your agency. So we'll start with a little bit of background. There's a Chinese proverb that says, may you live in interesting times. And we certainly live in interesting times today. And we've seen some of that incident and crisis situations occur just in the last few days in Belgium. But if you look at the world writ large, and this is Aon's 2016 political risk map, you get an idea of how complex and how uncertain and chaotic the world can really be. And even for those that might live in a relatively safe area in Europe, in Australia, in North America, your product and your networks and your supply chain probably stretch into some of these places that are not as safe or that are more volatile than others. And we're also confronted with situations like natural disasters as we see here. This is a flooding from 2010 in Rhode Island, where you see a shopping mall that has about 2 meters, 3 to 4 feet of water in it from a flood event. And then even the challenge that we're seeing today, particularly in South and Central America, from mosquitoes that are carrying the Zika virus. And here's another opportunity for a company to figure out how do they effectively manage through these types of incidents. So when we're talking about incident management or crisis management, whatever you want to describe that as, what we're really talking about is the active management of a disruption or a situation that is escalating, and you're trying to get ahead of that by managing it as an incident or as a crisis situation. Even when you're in an incident is really a bad time to start figuring out how you're going to manage it. You want to think through at least some aspects of incident management or crisis management in advance of this situation. And there's really kind of 5 key things that we need to have planned out in advance. And we're going to talk about these a little bit. The first one is that in advance of an incident, you need to have some clear roles and responsibilities defined. Which part of your organization will lead the incident, or which person in their role will be in command, so to speak, throughout the incident? What are the responsibilities of those that are going to be involved in managing the incident? What decision-making rights have been predefined? So if you have an incident leader, for example, where does their decision-making authority begin and end versus more senior leaders or top management within your organization? When you're in the disaster, when you're in the incident, what is the single source of truth? If I am a stakeholder or a member of your board or a leader, what am I receiving in terms of a communication product or message that's keeping me up to date and that I can trust as that single source of truth. This is where I go to understand the current state of the situation. And then lastly, we need some kind of mechanism of cross-functional coordination. How do we get people together across the various organizational silos and collaborate together in order to make decisions and communicate within the organization what's going on? When you were looking at an incident leader or the crisis leader, leadership becomes a very critical component of who leads that situation. And we know through experience and research that we'll talk about in a moment that those individuals need to exhibit certain leadership characteristics. And we see some of those here. A leader that's leading an incident has to be able to lead cross-functionally. By that, they need to be able to communicate up within the organization, and they need to be able to influence up within the organization. They have to be able to credibly speak to the situation and influence the decisions at a top management level. They also need to be able to do the same cross-functionally across your company or nonprofit or agency. They have to be able to pull together various functions like human resources and corporate security, information security, facilities management, the general counsel, and be able to bring them to the table to lead them through a collaborative discussion about how to manage that incident. Strong incident leaders have to be both strategic and tactical. From a strategic standpoint, they need to be able to see the whole organization and understand the influences that come in from the outside, such as the media, your investors, your other stakeholders. But tactically, they have to be willing to work on developing some very simple processes where needed and make sure that those are executed throughout the course of the incident. Strong incident leaders understand that their success throughout the incident won't happen just within their organization, within their silo. They have to be flexible and be able to pivot as the incident evolves. And then lastly, they need to possess extraordinary situational awareness. They have to understand the different influences on the situation, the incident that they're dealing with, and be able to react to those. There's been a significant body of research around what makes an effective incident leader. At Harvard University, since September 11th, 2001, they have led a program called the National Preparedness Leadership Initiative, or NPLI. And what they've done is they've looked at a number of national scale disasters, both inside and outside of the United States. And they've sat down with the leaders of these situations and talked with them in the moment, during the disaster, about what they were thinking and what decisions they were making and why. What was influencing them? What was concerning or causing them stress? And they turned this into a body of research. And the core publication talks about the 5 dimensions of meta leadership when you're leading through a large-scale incident or disaster. And they really focus on 5 dimensions. The first is how they describe the person of the meta leader, the person that is leading the incident, and their ability to be calm in the moment of stress, their ability to bring together those different silos and communicate clearly what's going on. The second, again, was situational awareness, and we're going to talk more about this in just a moment. And then there were 3 kind of core aspects of leadership. Their ability to lead their function. So if they were, for example, your company's head of crisis management or business continuity, they clearly had to have a strong, had to be a strong leader of that function. And then again, how do they lead up to top management, and how do they lead connectivity across the different silos within an organization? These 2 gentlemen, Dr. Lenny Marcus and Dr. Barry Dorn at Harvard, are the authors. You can read some more on their websites. The NPLI research team also talks a little bit about what they call the basement. And the basement is, if you know anything, I'm not a neuroscientist, but if you know anything about how our brains have evolved, the part of our brain that drives the fight or flight syndrome, where in your moment of fear and stress, and you really think about fighting or fleeing, fighting or running from a situation, that kind of primordial fear that happens, it's at the bottom of your brain. So they coined the term the basement, meaning that when you're in this great crisis, great incident as the leader, and you're not thinking clearly about what's going on, your brain kind of goes into the basement, and you start thinking about all the things that can go wrong. You start focusing on, how to flee from the situation. But understanding that that exists is a way, as a leader, that you're able to pull yourself up out of that kind of fight or flight syndrome and get your head back into the strategic place as the incident leader that you need to be. As we talk about crisis leadership, there's a great article in Harvard Business Review from 2013 by Eric McNulty, also from the same leadership program at Harvard, where Eric talks about what are the leadership characteristics that strong leaders exhibit during a major data breach. And he was writing at the time about the Target Corporation data breach, but he had 3 important lessons about how to lead and communicate in one of these incidents. The first is that, as we said before, there has to be certainty around how to make decisions and how to do strategic messaging during a situation, that we have thought through in advance how we're going to do this and what the decision-making rights are. That second, we need to understand the stakeholders in our crisis, and to the point where we may even want to map those out and understand that each has unique needs for information, and then to develop story arcs for each of those stakeholders. For example, for a company going through a major data breach situation, well, their employees will be one set of stakeholders. Their investors and institutional investors will be another. The press could be a third. The victims of the credit of the data breach could be a fourth. The regulators could be a fifth group of stakeholders. And they're all going to want something a little different. They're all going to have different needs for information. Some will need to be reassured. Some will just be looking and seeking information. And each will require a little different narrative in terms of communication. And lastly, that this crisis will evolve over time, that new information will come out and things will change during the course of that. When we evolve beyond just thinking of crisis leadership and we start thinking about how do we prepare for some of these incidents or crisis situations that could occur, then we start thinking about how do we plan and prepare for these situations. And so first, particularly when you're developing a new crisis or incident management process, that we want to start by just not getting fancy. We want to think about how do you activate your incident management process, and how do you share within your organization that you've activated and that you're actively managing a situation through this process. How will you provide updates to your company or nonprofit or public sector agency? And then lastly, what are the decisions that you have decided will be escalated to your top management, to your executive team? And what line have you drawn to require those escalations? Once you have those basics in place and you've thought through how to escalate and how to activate, and you've defined decision-making rights, then I think you can get to where most people want to start, which is making plans around specific things that can disrupt your business. But that needs to start with an understanding of what are those things that could disrupt your business. That's your risk assessment and your understanding of threats. And then prioritize those with your top management. What do you think your top risks are that don't have controls or other mitigating things in place? And then make plans for those key risks. And keep in mind that you can't plan for everything. You will have situations that will occur for which you don't have a plan. And that's okay, because what's more important is to have a decision-making framework, a incident management framework that lets you make those decisions in a collaborative way and using the leadership and planning that we just talked through. And here's an example for what that might look like within a company where you have a full-time or part-time incident management team here at the bottom. So these are your subject matter experts. Maybe this is their full-time job. in a larger company, but perhaps this is just someone's part-time role until a major incident does occur. In the middle, you have your cross-functional incident team. So here are the folks that you're pulling together across your agency or company to make these collaborative decisions across your different kind of business lines and support teams like human resources and legal and et cetera. And then lastly, you have your kind of executive incident team, your top management in most companies that are going to make your strategic decisions. And here, typically I recommend that if you're standing this up and your company is of any size whatsoever, that you separate the role of your top management, who really needs to be focused on strategy and on managing the reputation of your organization, and having this kind of middle management layer that is dealing with the day-to-day of managing through an incident. It's the right separation. It has the right people involved in details typically, and the right folks focused on strategy. So let's apply this to an example in terms of why frameworks are important. Well, most of us will remember in 2011 there was a major earthquake off the coast of Japan. It was one of the top 10 earthquakes in terms of severity in known world history. And following the earthquake, which was about 40 kilometers offshore, there was a massive tsunami wave that came ashore in northern Japan. This is a photo I took 4 months after the tsunami had hit. This is the coast of Sendai. I'm just south of the port area in Sendai. This was a housing development that was there on the coast, and what you're looking at are the foundations of homes that were washed away by the tsunami wave. And of course, this led to a third situation for Japan, which was the Fukushima nuclear reactor challenges. There was a fire. It led to some discharge of some material and et cetera, also in northern Japan. So Japan had three things happening at once, and there were three things that they had planned for. They had planned for a major earthquake. They were perhaps among the best in the world for preparation and response plans. They had a tsunami, for which they're also, I think, one of the better countries in the world in terms of preparedness and education and response capability. And they had this radiological problem, for which they're also one of the best in the world. Their challenge became they all three happened at once. And they went very quickly from what was a routine incident to a major situation for the country to deal with, not just because of how severe the situations were, but because they had never anticipated this kind of combination of events. And as we've said, for routine things, we can plan for those, and we can build preparedness and protocols and incident-specific plans. But following that, we have to have leaders that have a strategic view. We have to have good situational awareness of what's going on beyond just the situation we're dealing with. We have to have good collaborative cross-functional discussion so that we know we've moved over to the right, that we're in this uncharted territory. And that's where you could never predict that those three things were going to happen at the same time. So this is where your framework becomes valuable, because no matter what has happened, you can use the same decision-making mechanism, the same decision-making process, and the same communication decision-making process to manage through the situation despite not having a specific plan. If you want to read more about, in some more detail, thoughts on this type of model, there's a paper called Acting in Time Against Disaster by Dr. Dutch Leonard and Arnold Howitz from Harvard, also part of that National Preparedness Program, that will give you additional insight into their thoughts on Japan and what could have been done differently there. So to kind of summarize the incident leadership discussion, there's four key things as an incident leader for situational awareness that have to continue to be thought of through, which is what is happening, what do we know about it, what impact is that having on our organization, and what do we not know that we need to know about the situation? What is that kind of getting your head above the tactical and into details? When building these kind of processes, it's typical to run into objections. it's tough sometimes to sell the idea of preparedness, to sell the idea of building a good incident process. So, you know, you get a lot of questions about doing those things. Lots of ways to overcome that, but these are 5 that I found to be successful. The first is to tie your strategy to the support of your organization's strategic objectives. If your company, for example, is seeking to enhance their reputation amongst a certain group of stakeholders, it's likely that effective crisis or incident management can help with that. But you'll have to think about how to make that connection. You'll want to work to develop metrics that show that worth. I'm going to show an example of that in a moment. Think like a politician, kind of take the time to develop a narrative around your team, your strategy, perhaps even brand it, market it a little differently, but use that narrative relentlessly in your internal marketing and discussions. You can also bring in an outside expert to help drive your story. So the outside consultants or even a PR firm can help with those. And then lastly, if you have a company, a peer company that is kind of in the same industry as you, it's also an effective strategy to bring your senior leaders to go talk to their senior leaders about why they've done some things in the crisis, incident, business continuity space to help enhance what they're doing, and they can talk as peers around that. And I found that to be a very effective strategy as well. As we talk about developing metrics to help tell your story, I've found that in my career, I've found it very difficult to tell the positive financial stories around some of the things we do for incident management or for crisis management. And this is one that I have found successful. During Hurricane Sandy in 2012, I was leading the crisis management program at Target Corporation. And like other retailers, we had several hundred stores that were impacted by the hurricane in terms of having to close stores in advance of the storm and then reopen those, sometimes in the face of power disruptions and curfews and travel restrictions and lighting problems and everything else. But we knew that we were opening really fast. But what I didn't know is how fast were my competitors opening, and could we draw anything from that data? So we were able to get our trade group, our professional organization, the Retailers Industry Leaders Association, to survey other retailers that were impacted by Hurricane Sandy, and we could get day-by-day reopening rates. And so that's what you see here. I've anonymized this data so that you're not clear on which company is which. But let's say that mine did really well out of this. And then we were able to take this data telling us how quickly we had reopened versus our competitors. And we were able to have our business intelligence team really look at the data and then come back and tell us, well, we knew our sales information. And by looking at the reopening rates for others, we could model how much would we have lost in terms of sales and margin and profit had we reopened at the rate of our competitors. And we were able to show that difference, which was significant in the millions of dollars. And that made a very positive impression with our senior leaders and with our board of directors in that situation. So this was just one way of how do you tie your effective incident management back to your company's strategic objectives, which in our case was, get open quickly because it enhances our reputation, but we want to capture as much in terms of sales as we can in those situations. So I boil this down into some very practical and simple advice when it comes to your work role in terms of managing incidents effectively. Make sure you have clear roles and responsibilities, establish decision-making rights throughout your organization, have a plan on how you're going to communicate, and have some tools and processes in place for situational awareness. In your personal world, when it comes to your own preparedness with your family, be informed, have a plan. Where will you meet? How do you evacuate your home? If you're not able to get home, where would you meet your family? Have a kit. Think about water and extra clothes and perhaps some winter supplies and those things in your vehicle. And at least in the U.S., the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, has a website, ready.gov, that gives you some very practical advice as well. And I think that advice applies no matter what country you're in, but those of you that are outside the U.S., your countries probably do something similar. To wrap up, I think that incident management, effective incident management can really make a difference, that your ability to lead in a crisis situation can be critical. And you don't have to be a police officer or a military officer or a firefighter, part of the fire brigade, to be able to make those kind of differences. That your company will be faced with incidents, and you can really turn those into a competitive advantage for you and for your business. So we'll wrap up there, and I'll be happy to take your questions at this time.
Okay, thank you, Bryan, for your presentation. We have a few questions. The first one is, in case we know that one process can be threatened at any time, and we still have not found a solution for that threat, can we still run the process, or we have to stop it immediately?
So I think this is about a specific threat to an individual. Is that right?
Yes, but it's not mentioned here. So it just in any case, if you can just explain it in different cases. So.
Sure. I mean, I think if I understood the question correctly, you don't have to stop the process. I think that you can continue to run the process unless you're satisfied that that threat no longer exists. If you are talking about a threat of workplace violence or harassment, perhaps, you will definitely want to talk with your human resources and your legal team to understand the specific laws in your country. I know there are some different regulations out there in different workplaces throughout the world that you'll want to understand before you make the decision to stop a process.
Okay, the second question is, does company have to put a person in charge to deal with incident management, or it is an issue that the head of the company have to deal with it?
So I mean, ultimately your CEO or managing director, however you're set up, is going to be responsible for the overall management of the incident. But typically I see a middle manager or another officer like a vice president being put in charge of actually managing the details of the incident. So that would be that kind of middle cross-functional team of leaders, but somebody needs to be the coordinator. Somebody has to be responsible for that process, and they should be the one that escalates those up to your top management. If you're a much smaller company, then perhaps it is your top management that's managing the situation directly, but I think that that would be very rare in a larger company.
We have the last question. I think we have gone through this, but if you can just mention briefly a few. The question is, what do you consider to be the key factors on managing an incident in best effective manner?
So again, I think it's some of the things that we talked about. I think to me most important is to have some type of process in place prior to trying to manage the incident on how you will make decisions, how you will communicate, how will you escalate decisions to your top management so that you have a mechanism by which you're going to make these decisions. I think those are most important as a starting point to manage an incident effectively.
Okay, we have another question that came recently. Well, the question is, why do we have to follow the incident leadership? Why are they so important? Explain. Please explain it.
So if I understand this question, I mean, you want to have some type of mechanism in place for incident leadership. It's different than what you do day to day. Even in a small, let's say that you don't have an incident management process and you have an incident occur, I think you will run into the question of, okay, who's in charge and how are we going to communicate? How will we make decisions? How will we escalate those decisions? And those are going to be different than what your day-to-day, more methodical, planned-out decision-making process would be. I'll give a brief practical example. I had a client that I worked with last fall, large company in the United States, that had a really good process for managing small-scale business disruptions within their business. Their challenge became when those disruptions grew into a bigger problem for the company, and they needed to be managed by a more senior group of leaders, and it started to impact more than just one of their business lines. They had no mechanism, no process on how they were going to do that. So the CEO found himself really involved in a set of details that he shouldn't have to have been involved in. We should have been able to deal with middle management layer and then allow those to be escalated, certain decisions to be escalated up from there. And we really helped them build that process out, and it's turned into a much smoother incident process for them. That's in most companies, that's what you're going to want to have, is a way to, a decision-making process that you're starting in the middle or at the onset of an incident so that you can manage that in an effective way.
Okay, thank you, Bryan, for giving us this highly informative presentation. I believe the attendees had the chance to learn many new things today, and I suggest you to take time and see our future webinars that we will be hosting. Next Wednesday, we will host a webinar topic which is called Information Security Between Best Practices and ISO Standards. You can also take time and see our website www.pcb.com on the webinar section to register for our future webinar. Thank you once again, and hope to meet you soon in our future webinars.